One of the things that you learn in speech classes and debate kind of stuff is don't ever ask a question that you don't know the answer to. We're going to start with a question I don't know how you're going to answer, so it could ruin, just know this, raising your hands or not could ruin the rest of the sermon, okay? So how many of you have heard from someone, or maybe you said it yourself, if you're a good person, then you will go to heaven? I'm kidding. Okay, one more. How many of you have then had someone respond to you, oh, well, no, it doesn't work that way. Or, oh, no, you have to be more than good. Yeah. So this is an interesting one because I'm not going to address that at all. I just thought it was fun to ask. But this is sometimes how we think. We think, well, I'm a good person, or, well, they're a good person. And then somebody responds, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't matter if you're a good person. You need to do. And then they finish that with X, Y, Z to get into heaven or to be saved, or whatever language you want to use there to have a full life, whatever language that looks like. And we have a tendency to read into our text what we've been brought up with. And one of the things we've been brought up with is, no, that's not how it works. But every once in a while, we get into a text that kind of looks that way, or at least looks like, well, that religious stuff you do is not what it's about. And the prophets, which we're working through right now, the prophets have these really heart-to-heart moments with Israel and with Judah saying, okay, you need to check yourself because what you're doing right now doesn't really line up with things. Today I want to look at Amos. Amos is a tough one. He's like all doom and gloom. He's super harsh. There's no hope. Most of the prophets have this moment where there's but then God is going to have mercy on you. And Amos doesn't do that at all. At the end of the day, Amos says God's going to destroy you. And that's the full stop. That's the end of the sentence. So we're going to try to find some love out of Amos today and figure out what we're supposed to do with this. But as we look through these prophets, we're hearing from people that are looking at the world. They're looking at, not their church, but they're looking at their faith community and calling them out in a place that says, this is not what it's supposed to look like. Fun fact, Amos sort of rescued me from a watered-down faith that I was on my nice, lovely path toward. I had this sort of internal conflict, this struggle with what is faith supposed to be? What is religion supposed to be about? Many of you know I grew up in this nice, lovely, conservative Christian home with a nice, lovely, conservative Christian school that was connected to my church. So my entire world was this sort of 60 by 60 foot radius. And everything happened within that space. And so somebody like Amos totally shatters that space and asks you to remove yourself and rethink what's going on. And that's what happened when I started studying the prophets, and it was Amos that sort of called me out of that funk that says, this is not what this is about. This is not who you're supposed to be or what God is supposed to be doing in our world. So that's just some sort of background on why I would choose Amos in this sort of series on prophets when he's so much doom and gloom. Just like everything else, Amos is going to turn everything up on its end. We think we know what we're supposed to do. We think we understand how God works. We think that we're doing everything right and that we're comfortable in what we're doing. And Amos says, you've got it all wrong. You're missing the point completely. So just some background before we do Amos, because the prophets are really complex, right? We've kind of done a little bit of this. They're all over the place. They're in this sort of grouping together, but historically they come in at different points in time. And so it's helpful to know where and what is going on when a prophet is speaking or when we read about one of these prophets. Last week, we talked about the Assyrians that came in to overtake Israel, the northern kingdom Israel. And this week, Amos has the same message for Israel. Now, he's from the south. There's sort of this political play here going on. Think of it, well, I don't know how to tell you to think about it. He's from the south, and for Southerners, for Judah, everything is supposed to happen in Jerusalem. That's the only place that you can worship God. That's what you're supposed to do. For Israel, they don't have Jerusalem. So they have to think about God differently. They have to say, no, this is how God works. And so Amos is from the south, and he's going to go into Israel, and he's going to prophesy against Israel and what they're doing. So there's a little political play here going on. Don't miss that. It's easy for Canadians to look down at the U.S. right now and go, man, these people are off their rockers, and it's just getting worse and worse. That's very easy. And Amos, maybe like an American coming up here and telling you what you're doing wrong about faith, this is what Amos is doing in Israel. So the second thing that's going on, remember prophets often, so in the ancient Near East, in this region, prophets are often part of the royal kingdom, a part of the, like on the payroll in the royal courts. So this is not, prophets are not unique to Israel and Judah. They're not unique to Yahweh or God's story or whatever. Prophets are all over the place. And they are often in the kingship's payroll court system. And so the king says, hey, bring me a prophet to tell me what I'm supposed to do. Well, guess what? The prophet, unbelievably, always thinks the king is just phenomenal, and everywhere he goes, God's going to bless him and give him all the power and military battles won that he's looking for. Turns out it matters if you're on the payroll or not. So why is nobody telling Trump to change what he does? They're on the payroll, right? So Amos says specifically, as he launches into this ministry, as he launches into his prophetic career, he says, I am not a prophet. Or maybe I was not a prophet. He says specifically, I grow these great trees, and they give me a living, and I don't have anything to do with a king or a kingdom. I make my living off of my own, and I am not a prophet. That is to say, I am not a prophet in a king's court that is paid by the king. This is to say, I'm going to give you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not. And nobody's influencing that. God is influencing that. So those two things are important to remember. The next thing is that in the historical moment here, Israel looks a lot like all the other kingdoms. In fact, the statement about Assyria is coming is a little bit difficult because if we've located Amos right, then he wouldn't have known that Israel is actually coming. There's no impending doom. Assyria. He wouldn't have known that there's some impending doom of Syria. So here we are. He's going to tell them essentially what Assyria is going to do to them. But also, he's going to tell all of the other nations around, here's what you're doing wrong, and here's why God's going to destroy you. He doesn't mess around, and he's not partial, not at all. So we're going to look at a few of these and then move from there. All right, if you have your Bible, you can look at Amos. We're going to start in chapter 1. This is where we hear Amos's opening words and in terms of who is this guy going to be about? What are these prophecies going to look like? And to be honest, everything he begins with is perfectly in line with what they'd expect. He says, we'll start in verse 2. He says, the message, God roars from Zion, shouts from Jerusalem, the thunderclap voice withers the pastures tended by shepherds, shrivels Mount Carmel's proud peak. God's message, because of the 3 great sins of Damascus, this is not Israel, make that 4, I'm not putting up with her any longer. She pounded Gilead to a pulp, pounded her senseless with iron hammers and mauls. For that, I'm setting the palace of Hazael on fire. He's not messing around. There's no if they change or anything. It's just, that's it. We're going to skip down. Because of the 3 great sins of Gaza, make that 4, I'm not putting up with her any longer. She deported whole towns and then sold the people to Edom. Because of the 3 great sins of Tyre, make that 4, I'm not putting up with her any longer. She deported whole towns to Edom, breaking the treaty she had with her kin. For that, I'm burning down the walls of Tyre. You see, this Israel is loving. These are all of their enemies. And right on cue, Amos is naming everything that all of these bad nations do. Consider a sermon today. We might talk about, we could do some really petty stuff. All these sports teams and leagues that are having their games on Sunday morning, tearing us away from our churches and our religious upbringing. Or we could go on and talk about the policy makers that are running from people and setting abortion on its blazing path through our peoples. And we could go on and on, right? We have these sort of morality clauses that we can attack around our communities and our cultures and say, oh, the West and our degradation into secularism. This is the sermon that Amos is giving them. This is everything that's expected out of his faith community. But it's not the end of his sermon. You see, as we turn into chapter 2, if you're getting weary yet, hold on. As we turn into chapter 2, he's going to continue. Because of the 3 great sins of Moab, make that 4. That's just lots of them. Because of lots of them. I'm putting up with her any longer. She violated the corpse of Edom's king, burning it to cinders. That's not nice. And then, we're going to skip Judah just for a second because it's super vague. And then he turns his voice toward Israel. So at the end of that sermon, instead of continuing to talk about the degradation of secularism in our society, the pastor turns to the church and says, now the sins of the church are just as egregious. Because of the 3 great sins of Israel, make that 4. I'm not putting up with them any longer. They buy and sell upstanding people. People for them are only things, ways of making money. They'd sell a poor man for a pair of shoes. They'd sell their own grandmother. They grind the penniless into the dirt, shove the luckless into the ditch. Everyone and his brother sleeps with the sacred whore, a sacrilege against my holy name. Stuff they've extorted from the poor is piled up at the shrine of their God. That's Yahweh. That's God. While they sit around drinking wine, they've conned from their victims. It's kind of harsh. But he's looking around at a community that is happy in their place, in their religious place, that is happy in their faith world, that is going into the marketplace and committing egregious acts against humankind. And he says, it's not okay. You see, now if you read the Kings in the same time period, they have a different view of things. You can go look at 1st and 2nd Kings. For the kings, if you are upholding the religious traditions properly, everything is good. If you're worshiping at the temple, if you're making your sacrifices, everything is good. For that sermon that talks about the world and where we're headed and everything, if you're showing up to church, everything is good. For Amos, the problem is not in the temple. The problem is not with their sacrifices or with how they are practicing their religion. The problem is that those things are giving them comfort so that they don't practice their faith in the marketplace. That's the story that rescued me out of that watered-down faith, aside from all the doom and gloom that comes. You see, Amos is so concerned about what we're doing on our daily life, that we're good people. He doesn't care about whether you're going to temple or whether you're making the right sacrifices or whether you're bringing your tithe every third day. In fact, he says, chapter 4 now, listen to this, this is great, you cows of Bashan, grazing on the slopes of Samaria, you women mean to the poor, cruel to the down and out, indolent and pampered, you demand your husbands, bring us a tall, cool drink. Come along to Bethel and sin, and then to Gilgal and sin some more. Bring your sacrifices for morning worship. Every third day you bring your tithe, burn pure sacrifices, thank offerings. You see, they're doing everything right by some standard. But on the flip side, they're doing everything wrong by the standards of caring for people and looking after their neighbor. So we do this same thing today. We talk about the sort of the morality of our worship, that the church is the place where we do our religion, and we don't take it into the marketplaces. You see, for Amos, it's not about the temple, it's about the marketplace. How are we carrying our faith into the world around us? That's a prophetic voice in a world that is focused on religiosity. That is a prophetic voice in a world that is focused on making sure we do all the right things to make God happy and turning a blind eye to the down and out, to the poor, and even oppressing to create poverty in those around us. Now, you're probably not oppressing anyone when you go out into your community. It's much more subtle than that. But the point is not that. The point is to carry our faith into our world instead of bringing our faith into the church. And we do this in really subtle ways. In fact, the focus, so he's talking about sacrifices and tithing and offerings. He says, speak up, announce free will offerings. That's the sort of religious show you Israelites just love. Speak up, bring your tithes, sing your songs. That's the sort of religious show that you love. But if you don't carry it back out into the community, all of it is pointless. And when Jesus comes to the scene, a few hundred years later, several hundred years later, he recalls a similar quote, saying, God desires mercy, not sacrifices. God desires you to practice your faith and God's love in your community, in your families, in your neighborhoods, and caring for those around you. the sacrifices and the religious stuff is icing on the cake. It's not the point. It's part of the process, but it's not the point of the process. And this is the scary part here. For Amos, he recognizes that this sacrifice and the tithing and the religious process makes them comfortable to go out and practice their life however they want. And that's the subtlety that impedes on our own faith, is that we begin to feel good about ourselves because we made it to church and forget that that faith needs to be carried out into our community. I grew up in a space that was less concerned about carrying it out in my community and more concerned about my own personal morality or salvation or whatever individual word there. But the totality of Amos's cry out to God and to these people is, it's not just you. It's about your community. It's not about your own faith journey. It's about your community's process to care for one another and to do the right thing in your daily life. And it's interesting because today we talk about sin and we talk about being good people. We talk about our morality. We talk about our salvation. We talk about our faith in almost purely individualistic terms. It's part of our society. It's almost like we can't help it because this is how we live and breathe and understand the world around us. But for Amos, there is none of that. It's not an individual thing. It is happening on an individual level, but it is a communal level. And his doom and gloom message for Israel is also on a communal level. God's not going to destroy each individual that does this. God's going to destroy all of you. Assyria is going to come and deport all of you, not one of you for making a bad decision. And I don't say that to say God's coming to destroy all of us. I'd say that to say it's not always an individual thing. That it is part of our community that we come together and that we work as a community to make this a better place, and that we work as a community to live out God's love in our world. Is that doom and gloom enough? Is that harsh enough? I'm from Texas. The point is not the doom. The point is that Amos is calling these people to live a life that cares for God's people. And what's interesting is that in each of those sermons to those other nations, you would expect something religious in hand. But on each of those, remember that? On each of those, they were cries against humanity. You decimated the king's ashes. You deported a whole town of Edom. You destroyed a people and mauled them with your swords. These are cries against humanity. They are not, you failed to worship the right God in the right place at the right time. They are, you took advantage of people. You didn't treat them well. So in this moment, we raise our hands and go, yeah, I've heard that message about be a good person. Because Amos gave it to me. And he didn't follow that with, and you have to do more. You can take what you want with that. But he didn't follow it up with anything. He said, you need to take your faith into your community, into your world, and live it out with pure love and a sacrificial concern for your neighbor and for your community. And guess what? You got to do that together.